A man wrote to me on a Sunday night. It was almost 2 in the morning. He mentioned that, as if the hour mattered. Maybe it did. Maybe some things can only be written when the house is completely quiet and there's no one left to pretend for. His name was Gerald. He was 73 years old. And he started his letter with a sentence I haven't been able to stop thinking about since. He wrote, "I was a good man. I just wasn't there." I want to sit with that for a moment before I tell you the rest of his story, because I think a lot of people, maybe someone watching this right now, will recognize something in those 8 words. Not the guilt of a bad man, the quieter, harder guilt of a man who did everything right and still got it wrong. Gerald worked in logistics management for 38 years. He drove the same route to the same office building every morning, parked in the same spot, second row near the entrance, because he always arrived before 7. He was the kind of man who never missed a deadline, never left early, never called in sick unless he genuinely couldn't stand. His boss respected him. His colleagues respected him. He paid the mortgage 15 years ahead of schedule. He put 2 children through university without a single loan. He was, by every visible measure, a success. His wife's name was Miriam. They met when he was 29 and she was 27, at a company dinner neither of them particularly wanted to attend. She told him later that she'd noticed him because he was the only person in the room who looked like he'd rather be reading. He told her that was exactly what he'd been thinking about her. They were married 11 months later, on a Saturday in October, in a small ceremony with 40 guests and a cake Miriam's mother had baked herself. 3 layers, lemon, slightly lopsided on the left side. Gerald described their marriage the way you might describe a house you've lived in for decades. Familiar, solid, worn in the places you use most. He loved her. He was certain of that. He just didn't always know how to show it in the ways she needed. Miriam was a talker. Gerald was not. She would tell him about her day in long, winding sentences. The neighbor who'd said something strange at the market, the book she was halfway through, a memory that had surfaced for no reason while she was washing dishes. Gerald would listen, or he thought he was listening. He would nod, make the right sounds, and then drift back to the thing he'd been thinking about before she started, a delivery schedule, a budget projection, the quiet accumulation of tomorrow's responsibilities. He told me he didn't realize he'd been doing this for years until he couldn't anymore. Miriam was diagnosed with a progressive neurological condition when she was 64. The kind that takes things slowly, first some words, then some coordination, then, gradually, the long, winding sentences stopped being possible. For 4 years, Gerald watched his wife disappear from herself one piece at a time. And for the first time in their marriage, in his adult life really, he had nowhere to be. He had retired the year before her diagnosis, and suddenly the thing he'd built his identity around for 4 decades was simply gone. So he sat with her. Every morning he made 2 cups of tea, something he'd never done before, always left to her, and brought them to the sitting room where they would watch the birds at the garden feeder Miriam had hung outside the window 12 years earlier. He hadn't noticed it before. He had seen it, certainly, but he'd never looked at it. Now he looked at it every morning because Miriam looked at it, and it seemed important, necessary even, to look at the same things she did. He read to her. novels she'd mentioned wanting to read over the years. He'd kept a list without telling her on a folded piece of paper in his desk drawer. He'd been keeping it for 15 years without quite knowing why. He read slowly now. He stopped when something seemed to interest her. He stopped when he himself was moved and didn't want to rush past it. He learned at 70 years old how to be in a room with another person without leaving. Miriam died on a Wednesday in March at 6 in the morning while Gerald was still asleep in the chair beside her bed. He had not wanted to leave the room, but he had not wanted to stare at her either, so he'd read until he fell asleep. A novel about a man returning to a town he'd left decades before, and when he woke, she was gone. The tea on her side table was cold. The birds were already at the feeder. He told me the last real conversation they'd had, the last time she had enough words to say something whole, was about 3 weeks before the end. She'd looked at him with the particular clarity that sometimes came in the mornings before the day wore her out, and she had said, "I liked this, these past years. I liked who you were here." Not, "I love you." Not, "Thank you." Not, "I forgive you," which is what Gerald said he'd half expected and half dreaded. "I liked who you were here." He said he didn't understand it at first, thought it was the condition, words surfacing in the wrong order, meaning something adjacent to what she'd intended. But she'd looked at him with clear eyes. She'd been deliberate. She'd meant exactly what she said. He spent the months after her death trying to understand it. And what he eventually arrived at, what he wrote to me on that Sunday at 2 in the morning, was something that took him 73 years and the death of his wife to learn. She wasn't telling him she'd loved these last years despite everything that came before. She was telling him she had finally met him, that the man she'd always suspected was in there somewhere, behind all the arriving before 7 and leaving after dark and nodding without listening. That man had finally come out. She'd had 3 years with him, and she had liked him, not in a resigned way, in a real way. Gerald was grateful for those 3 years. He said that clearly. But he also wrote something else. And this is the part I keep returning to, no matter how many times I read his letter. He wrote, "I had 41 years with her, and I was there for 3 of them." He didn't write it with anger. There was no theatrical self-pity, none that felt performed anyway. Just a man alone in a quiet house at 2 in the morning, looking at something clearly for the first time and saying it out loud. I don't know exactly what Gerald does with his mornings now. I imagine he still makes 2 cups of tea sometimes and sets one on the side of the table where she used to sit, and then doesn't know what to do with it. I imagine he still looks at the bird feeder. I imagine there are days the birds come and he wants to tell someone. I don't think what he carries has a clean resolution. I don't think it's supposed to. But I keep thinking about what it means, that a woman spent 4 decades waiting for a version of her husband that only arrived when there was finally nothing left to distract him. That he was capable of that presence the entire time, that it was never unavailable. It was just never chosen. Gerald is not a villain in his own story. That's what makes it so hard to look at. He was responsible. He was faithful. He showed up to every obligation except the quiet daily one of simply being with the person who had chosen him. Miriam got 3 years with the man Gerald could have been. I think about that. I think about how many people are in the middle of the 41 years right now, certain they are doing enough, certain that love declared is love received, certain there will be time later for the sitting still and the watching birds and the reading slowly. There might be. I hope there is. But I also know what Gerald would say to that hope. He would fold it carefully, put it in a drawer, and tell you not to wait until you have no other choice.